Hello everybody, and welcome back to a brand new video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the 2024 Nebraska Senate race, and yes, you heard that right, we're talking about Nebraska today, but before you click away, just listen for the next 20-30 seconds. Nebraska, in the past 5 polls, we've seen all of them be under 4% lead for the Republicans, and we've seen one of them actually have a lead, not for the Republicans, but for the independent candidate. So, Nebraska Senate race. This year, there's 2 elections in Nebraska. There's a normal Senate election that was originally scheduled, and then there's a special Senate election that was scheduled because Ben Sasse, the former GOP senator here, left the Senate. And in the normal election, Democrats are predictably losing in the polls by nearly 20 points. But in the special election, Democrats did not run a candidate. Instead, an independent named Dan Osborne, who is a former Democrat and is likely going to be supported by Democrats come November, he's running. And he is doing very well in the polls. We've had 5 polls of this race. 1, he's up by 2. He's down by 4 here. He's tied here. He's down by 2 here. And he's down by 1 here. So, early on, the polls show a competitive race. And again, this is likely because, obviously, it is an independent running against a Republican, not a Democrat versus a Republican. We know historically in blue states, independents do better than Republicans, and in red states, independents do better than Democrats. At least they make these races competitive. So today, I'm here to tell you about Nebraska and whether or not an upset is truly brewing here. So again, let's get into it. Independent versus Republican. Let's talk about Nebraska as a whole. This is a state that, as we all know, is deeply Republican, but it might be a bit bluer than you think. Donald Trump only won it by 19 points in 2020, so it wasn't necessarily as red as the Dakotas or Wyoming or Idaho. It was red, but not as deep red as you might think. And Joe Biden did win a congressional district here. He won the 2nd district, which is around here. It is in Douglas, Sarpy, and Saunders County, mostly in Douglas County, which is where Omaha is. And it voted for Biden by around 6 points in 2020, and it's likely that Kamala Harris is going to carry that district once again in November for the Democratic Party. So Nebraska, it's trending blue. It's moved a bit to the left in recent years. And we've seen Democrats statewide start to improve their margins. And they're not close to winning statewide, but they're losing by, instead of 25 in the case of Joe Biden, they're only losing by 19. So this is an interesting state. It has interesting trends. And broadly, Democrats have gained a bit of momentum here in recent years. But this Senate race is fascinating because the latest polls have it very close. Now, the caveat, obviously, was that most of these polls we were getting, 3 of them were sponsored by Dan Osborne, the other one was sponsored by an independent party-affiliated poll, which obviously endorsed Osborne, and they show this race close. But 2 days ago, we got a poll from Survey USA. This was sponsored by Split Ticket, which is a nonpartisan news organization run by actually a few people that I follow on Twitter. And this is a very reputable organization. Big fan of Split Ticket. They do amazing things. And they sponsored this poll. And they're again, nonpartisan. And they found that the race for Senate was just 1 point separating Deb Fischer and Dan Osborne, which is fascinating because normally in Nebraska, you wouldn't expect a Senate race to be competitive. But again, I read their write-up. Their conclusion was that it was competitive because Dan Osborne is running as an independent. And again, this poll looks pretty good other than that, right? Like they found Donald Trump up by 17 points statewide, which is feasible. He could win by 17 against Kamala Harris. He won it by 19 in 2020, and he won it by, I think, 23 or 24 in 2016. So if that trend repeated, he could win it by 17. And we saw in Nebraska's 2nd district, we saw Kamala Harris led by 5, which is certainly fair. Don Bacon, the GOP incumbent in the House, they're actually losing by 6, which is another problem for Republicans, but that's not the topic of discussion today. But yeah, this poll makes a lot of sense, and they still found a close race for Senate between Fischer and Osborne. So just to kind of talk about, the history of independents running for Senate, it's a good strategy. When you are a Democrat in a red state or a Republican in a blue state, it's usually not very productive to run a campaign for Senate or for governor or for any statewide office, right? Because usually in a state like Nebraska, which is so partisan in favor of the GOP, voters will see a Democrat and they'll just think, nope, I'm voting Republican. An independent, though, has made that closer, and we have a few case studies I want to look at today. The first is actually from 2022. It's Utah, and Democrats did not run a candidate here. Instead, they kind of coalesced behind Evan McMullin, who's an independent, and McMullin actually was a former Republican, very conservative, endorsed Mitt Romney and John McCain, but turned against the GOP in the era of Trump. So he ran an independent campaign for Senate, and he actually did a lot better than a lot of people thought he would. I thought he'd lose by like 17 or 18, and he only lost by 11. He did very well. And he actually won a county that Trump won in 2020. And so McMullen only lost by 11 in a state that is very deeply conservative, very deeply Republican. So we know that there are, a certain level, especially in a red state, there's a certain number of Republican voters who are willing to vote for an independent candidate for Senate. And, to kind of go back to a Great Plains state, because Utah is definitely, in terms of partisanship, similar to Nebraska, right? Like this state voted for Trump by 20 and a half. Nebraska voted for him by 19. So they're very similar. Utah's only 1.5% more red than Nebraska is. But, to go to the Great Plains, let's talk about Kansas, because Kansas in 2014, we saw a similar thing. Now, this was obviously 10 years ago, but, not too far off. And Pat Roberts, the GOP incumbent, won by only 10 points against Greg Ormond. Now, to be fair, Greg Ormond was actually thought to have a good chance of winning this race. In 2022, Evan McMullen, no one thought he had a chance. So this was impressive at the time. This result was kind of a mixed bag. Obviously, Greg Ormond did outrun Barack Obama in the state, so it was seen as, a respectable performance. But a lot of people thought he was going to be able to win. And obviously, he did not come close to winning. But regardless, in the grand scheme of things, this was the best performance that a Democrat had for Senate, or that a non-Republican had for Senate in a while here. In 2020, a lot of people thought this race was going to be competitive, but it was actually less close. It was an 11.5-point margin for Roger Marshall against Barbara Bollier, the Democrat, and I actually covered this race back in 2020. A lot of people thought this race was also going to be pretty close, but it was actually less close in this race by, just a few percentage points. So again, independents do well in red states when Democrats kind of substitute and remove themselves from the picture, because there's a certain number of Republicans who are willing to vote for an independent, but they wouldn't vote for a Democrat, at least in a Senate race. And so in Nebraska, that's kind of what we're getting, right? Is we see in the normal Senate race, Pete Ricketts, the Republican, leads the Democrat Love by 17. But on the same ballot when Democrats don't run a candidate and instead, the independent is the main opposition, a lot more people are willing to vote for him. Again, it's 38 to 33. But notably, a lot of Republicans are undecided. So a lot of Republicans are going to vote for Pete Ricketts for Senate and then Donald Trump for president. In the other Senate race, they don't know who they're going to vote for. And that's where this comes from. That's why this race fundamentally is close right now, is because Democrats are getting behind Dan Osborne. A couple of Republicans are already voting for him, but a lot of Republican voters who should be safe for this party are undecided. So let's talk about it. The polls have it close. We've gotten a nonpartisan survey to show a genuinely close race. We have all the signs of a competitive race. The one thing that I would caution against is that number of independents. Again, 38 plus 39, that only adds up to 77, unless I do my math wrong. That's 77% voters are decided. So you have almost a quarter of the electorate that does not know who they're going to vote for. But we know that this quarter is very Republican leaning, because in 2020, again, Joe Biden, let's see, he got 39% of the vote in Nebraska. Osborne's almost already there. He's at 38%. But Donald Trump got 58% of the vote. Deb Fischer's at 39%. So the majority of these voters are Republicans. They're not decided who they're going to vote for yet. And while some of them are going to come and vote for Osborne, maybe he'll get to 43 or 44, not enough of them to get him close to winning. So this race to me is a classic example of, look, early on, some people are interested in the idea of voting for an independent. Maybe it's close right now, but come October, come November, once polarization sets in, once people come out to vote for Trump in this deeply Republican state, they're going to come out and vote for Deb Fischer. So right now, with a lot of undecideds left, sure, it's within a couple points. But once those undecideds come home for the Republican, as they usually do, and this happened in Kansas in 2014, if you look at the early polling, I will show you the general election polling. Early on, Greg Ormond actually had more leads than not. But again, in the final 6-7 polls, he didn't lead. So we could see a similar thing. Early on, right now, Dan Osborne is competitive. But come October, come November, I think he'll be down by 10, 12, 15 points. So this race, to me, it's interesting. I'm glad we finally got a nonpartisan poll, so thank you, Split Ticket. But I'm still going to believe that Republicans are going to win this race decisively. Trump won the state by 19 in November 2020. I think he wins by a similar amount this year, maybe a point or so less. I think Deb Fischer wins by 13 or 14. It'll be closer than we would have originally thought a few months ago, but still, the fact that there's so many undecided voters left, we know those are going to be Republicans, and we know that the majority of them are going to break for the Republican incumbent senator. So Democrats and independents who want Osborne to win, I think for them to truly have a chance here, we're going to have to see another poll come September or October that shows maybe another tied race. But instead of being 38-39, maybe 47-47 to show that we actually have a ball game where you have Republicans crossing over, committed to vote for Dan Osborne. Until then, I'm sticking with my prediction. This race is going to go Republican. So let me know what you all think. Tell me what your prediction is for this race. Tell me if you have any videos you want to see next, and I'll see you all tomorrow.